Jasmine Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She leaned in, calm and deliberate, and with a half-smile that cut sharper than any blade, delivered the line that would echo through every hallway in Washington. The only thing thicker than your hypocrisy is the list of gifts you forgot to report. Silence. Then gasps. A stifled laugh. Someone off camera whispered, "Oh my God!" The moment froze in time. Clarence Thomas blinked, stone-faced, his hand twitching just slightly. The smug veneer cracked. The crowd? On fire. Phones up, cameras rolling, history being captured in real time. This wasn't just a committee hearing. This was a reckoning. A black woman from Texas, with fire in her voice and the Constitution in her back pocket, just sliced through decades of unchallenged power. The clip would hit 10 million views before the day was out. Twitter? Unhinged? TikTok? Reenactments? Hashtags? Exploding. But behind the mic drop, behind the thunderous applause and the viral chaos, there was a deeper story. One built not just on confrontation, but on years of tension, silence, and rot at the core of the system, because Jasmine Crockett didn't just show up for a takedown. She came to expose a truth that too many had tiptoed around for too long. And Clarence Thomas, Supreme Court Justice, conservative icon, untouchable to some, had just been hit with a truth he couldn't overrule. No gavel could save him now, but here's the thing about moments like these. They don't come out of nowhere. They simmer. They build. And then they erupt. So how did this one begin? What chain of arrogance, silence, and unchecked privilege led to this explosion? Why did the room erupt like that? Why did she speak when so many stayed silent? And what was the straw that finally broke this stone-faced institution's back? To understand why the room erupted, we need to go back and see how arrogance set up this downfall. The headlines had been circling for months, each more damning than the last. Private luxury trips paid for by billionaire donors. Lavish gifts hidden behind opaque loopholes. A Supreme Court justice, Clarence Thomas, embroiled in a scandal so deep it rattled the very foundation of the institution he was sworn to protect. And yet, inside the Capitol, there was silence. Not from the public. They were furious. Not from the media. They were relentless. But from the very chambers meant to check that power? Nothing but polite shrugs and closed-door whispers. Accountability, it seemed, was optional at the highest levels. That silence? It was suffocating, especially for the new generation. Rising leaders, sharp, diverse, unbought, were watching closely. They weren't raised in the backrooms of power. They didn't owe favors to legacy names or hide behind ceremonial decorum. They had lived the struggles. They carried the scars. And they had come to Congress not to play politics, but to shake its foundations. Jasmine Crockett was one of them. When she walked into that hearing room, there was no entourage, no airs, just a quiet fire behind her eyes, and a folder thick with receipts. To some, she was just a freshman congresswoman, a name barely known outside her district, dismissed, ignored, underestimated. But to those who had been paying attention, the ones who saw her dissect legal arguments on the House floor with surgical precision, she was something else entirely. A storm in heels, armed with the law, the truth, and zero tolerance for hypocrisy. And she had been watching Clarence Thomas dodge questions with smirks, watching his allies spin excuses in the media, watching the system bend once again to shield power from consequence. But Crockett hadn't come to play along. She had come to confront a question that had haunted millions. How far can someone fall before we say, enough? This wasn't just about one man. It was about the rot that let him rise unchecked, about a system that protected him, defended him, enabled him, while punishing those with far less, for far less. The hearing was supposed to be procedural, Just another box ticked in a long chain of formalities, but not this time. Not with Crockett at the mic, because she wasn't here to be polite. She wasn't here to keep the peace. She was here to rupture it, and as she flipped open her folder, took a breath and locked eyes across the room, the air shifted. Something historic was about to unfold. But Crockett wasn't just entering a debate. She was walking straight into a political battlefield. Clarence Thomas once called himself a man of the people, a child of poverty who rose through the ranks by grit, not privilege. That was the story. Polished, rehearsed, repeated. But somewhere, along the way, the story fractured. Because the man who once spoke about struggle now vacations on private yachts. The justice who once warned about the elites now dines with billionaires who bankroll his luxury getaways. The robe stayed black, but the man beneath it changed, and America noticed. Reports began to surface, first as whispers, then as thunderclaps. Real estate deals hidden from disclosure. Lavish trips financed by Republican megadonor Harlan Crow, complete with exotic travel, private jets, and five-star accommodations. Artwork, tuition for a relative, even a purchase of Thomas's mother's home, where she continued to live, rent-free. None of it reported. None of it questioned. Until now. Ethics watchdogs cried foul. Legal scholars sounded alarms, and yet Thomas barely blinked. When confronted, he offered excuses that sounded less like accountability and more like royalty explaining tradition. "They're my friends," he said. "I didn't think I had to disclose that," he shrugged. "It didn't affect my work," he insisted, but for millions of Americans, it wasn't about technicalities. It was about trust. How could the highest court in the land be immune from the very transparency expected of school board members and city clerks? How could justice be blind if it vacationed in the arms of billionaires? Worse still was the smugness. The sense that no matter what surfaced, nothing would stick. That Clarence Thomas was untouchable, not just because of his position, but because of a system designed to protect power, not check it. He dismissed questions, mocked critics, leaned further into the arms of the hard-right machine that had defended him since the Anita Hill hearings decades earlier. Yes, those hearings, the first real national fracture in his image. A young law professor, a nation watching, accusations of sexual harassment. A moment that tested his reputation and the country's conscience. He survived that storm, but the stain never left. In the decades that followed, he carved out a role as the court's most staunch conservative, a voice against affirmative action, a reliable vote for corporate interests, often silent during oral arguments, but unshakably loyal to the ideological right. And while the public profile of his fellow justices shifted with time, Thomas remained distant, aloof, above reproach, almost regal in his detachment. No press, conferences, no apologies, no accountability. Just the quiet confidence of someone who believed the rules didn't apply to him. His defenders called it resilience. His critics called it arrogance. But to those watching closely, it felt like something worse. The final form of institutional rot. A justice who wielded enormous power, yet answered to no one. And as the scandals mounted, so too did the fatigue. Americans tired of the double standards, of watching power dodge responsibility, of watching those at the top take and never give back. Clarence Thomas became the embodiment of that fatigue, a symbol not just of one man's fall, but of a system that lifted him, protected him, and let him soar above the rules everyone else was forced to follow. And still, he sat with a smirk, untouched, unbothered. The confidence wasn't just in his words, it was in his silence, a kind of arrogance only found in those who believe the walls will never close in. But walls have cracks, and history has a way of finding them. He couldn't see it yet, but the air was changing. The anger was no longer just on the outside. It had entered the room, and it came in the form of a congresswoman from Texas, a woman with fire behind her voice, and no patience for men who smirked their way through scandal. And yet, he had no idea that the quiet storm brewing in Jasmine Crockett would be the moment his confidence shattered. Jasmine Crockett never needed permission to speak truth. She just needed a microphone. Born and raised in St. Louis, Missouri, Crockett grew up knowing the power of words, but also the pain of being unheard. Her community was no stranger to struggle, over-policed, underfunded, and often ignored. But it was also filled with brilliance, resilience, and unbreakable pride. That duality, grit and hope, shaped her into someone who refused to look away from injustice. Long before Congress knew her name, courtrooms in Texas did. She started as a civil rights attorney in Dallas, defending those who had been silenced, ignored, or outright erased by the system. She didn't walk into court with arrogance. She walked in with fire. And unlike so many polished politicians, she didn't rehearse empathy. She lived it. When she stood beside a client, it wasn't just a case, it was a mirror. Because she had been underestimated too. Not flashy, not wealthy, not connected to a political dynasty, just principled, just relentless. That's what made her dangerous to those in power. Her rise to Congress wasn't handed to her. It was a brawl, a special election, a chaotic field. The odds stacked high, but Crockett didn't flinch. She knocked doors. She showed up. She debated. And she did it all with a style that was unapologetically her own, sharp, strategic, and real. When voters sent her to Washington, they didn't send another echo. They sent a megaphone, and almost instantly she made noise. Not the performative kind, the kind that echoed in hearing rooms, the kind that made committee chairs sit up straighter, the kind that forced people to Google her name. She was direct, surgical in her arguments, and fearless in her tone. And yes, she was different. She wore her hair natural. She spoke with rhythm. She asked questions others wouldn't. And she did it all while refusing to play the game of political niceties that had long protected the powerful. She was a freshman, yes, but she wasn't there to wait her turn. She was there to speak for communities that had been waiting far too long. Communities like the one she came from. Black, brown, working class, immigrant rich. Communities that understood struggle not as a concept, but as a constant. She carried their stories with her like armor. Every smirk from a condescending colleague. She'd seen it before. Every patronizing dismissal from an elder statesman. She'd swallowed those before too, but she didn't let it harden her. It sharpened her. Because Jasmine Crockett didn't want to just exist in those rooms. She wanted to shift them. And while others tried to fit in, she dared to stand out. In committee hearings, she became known for her cutting clarity. She didn't ramble. She didn't filibuster. She struck, and while some rolled their eyes, others leaned in. She had that rare mix, authenticity and authority, passion and precision, style and substance. And the more she spoke, the more people realized she wasn't just talking for herself. She was talking for the mother juggling 2 jobs just to afford insulin, for the immigrant family afraid to report wage theft because of deportation threats, for the teenager arrested for a petty offense while billionaires committed crimes with impunity. She spoke for them because she was them. And in the halls of Congress, filled with millionaires, legacy politicians, and polished lobbyists, she was a reminder of what democracy was supposed to look like. When the Clarence Thomas ethics scandal began to unfold, Crockett didn't jump in immediately. She watched, she read the filings, she tracked the disclosures, she listened to the excuses, and she waited, because unlike her critics, Crockett knew the value of timing. She understood that one well-placed question could do more damage than an entire speech. And when she saw the system lining up to defend the indefensible, She didn't reach for outrage. She reached for receipts. She prepared, not just to confront Thomas, but to confront the culture that enabled him. She knew she wouldn't get the last word, but she would get the right one, and she understood the weight of that opportunity. This wasn't just about Clarence Thomas's actions. It was about the message sent to every black child watching, every immigrant kid told to wait their turn, every woman told she was too angry, too loud, too much. She was going to show them what happened when someone refused to shrink, because the moment wasn't about politics. It was about power, and what it looks like when someone speaks truth to it, unapologetically. And when the stage was set, she knew the time had come to unleash her voice. The room buzzed with tension. You could feel it in the air, thick, restless, electric. The hearing had officially begun, but no one was fooled. This wasn't just another procedural charade. This was theater. This was war. Thomas wasn't there physically. Supreme Court justices rarely are, but his shadow loomed large. His defenders took the mic first, each more performative than the last. They didn't talk about corruption. They didn't talk about facts. They talked about legacy. They talked about attack campaigns. They talked about how Clarence Thomas was being targeted, a victim, they claimed, of ideological vengeance and media distortion. One senator leaned in, voice dripping with indignation, calling it a smear job against a great American. Another wagged a finger toward the minority side of the chamber, accusing them of trying to tear down a man whose only crime was success. Crockett didn't blink. She sat quietly, poised, fingers laced, eyes fixed forward. She didn't roll. Her eyes. She didn't interrupt. She didn't react because she didn't need to. The louder they got, the more obvious it became. They weren't defending truth. They were defending power. Desperate. Defensive. Shrinking behind rhetoric, not rising. With facts. The crowd behind the dais, activists, reporters, interns, shifted in their seats. Some exchanged glances. Others whispered. Phones recorded. Tweets flew in real time. The sense was clear. Something was building. Something was coming. One of Thomas's allies tried a new tactic, downplaying the scandal entirely. These so-called trips. Who among us hasn't accepted a gift from a friend? Laughter. Not from amusement, but disbelief. Crockett smiled. Just slightly, because that was the moment the mask slipped. The desperation was now visible, tangible. The defenses had stopped being clever and started being careless, and that's when the tone shifted. Because if they were going to pretend this was normal, Crockett knew it was time to remind them, and the country, what corruption actually looks like. She adjusted her mic. The room noticed. The crowd stilled. Even her colleagues stopped shuffling papers, because Crockett didn't speak unless she had something that would land. And they all knew. Something was coming. The last speaker, a gray-haired congressman with decades of tenure, wrapped his defense of Thomas with a heavy sigh. We must rise above political theater and respect those who've served this nation. Crockett's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in calculation. Her moment had arrived, not to shout, not to lecture, but to correct the record, to lift the curtain on the charade, and to remind the country that defending corruption in a robe was still corruption. And then, in a moment that silenced even her critics, she struck Jasmine Crockett, leaned forward, her voice steady, low, deliberate, and unmistakably surgical. I want to thank my colleagues for their passionate defenses. Truly, I've never seen so many mental gymnastics performed in such perfect synchronization. A ripple of tension broke across the room. Someone coughed to hide a chuckle. Cameras zoomed in. But let's be clear. This isn't about political theater. This is about the integrity of the highest court in the land. And the man whose name keeps coming up isn't a victim. He's a symptom. She picked up a small stack of documents from her folder and held them up. These? These aren't rumors. They're not social media threads. They're financial disclosures, or more precisely, missing financial disclosures. One by one, she laid them down on the table like playing cards. Luxury vacations, private jet flights, property transfers, tuition payments for a relative, all provided by a billionaire with an agenda. Pause. Clarence Thomas didn't forget to report these. He chose not to. Now the murmurs turned into a low roar. Onlookers stirred. Reporters scribbled. Phones were already uploading, Crockett continued. For decades, we've been told the court is above politics, that it functions as a sacred institution, unbiased, ethical, beyond reproach. She looked straight ahead. But tell me, how is it ethical for a sitting justice to accept hundreds of thousands of dollars in unreported gifts from someone with business interests before the court? No answer. Just silence, thick and deafening. How is it ethical to claim ignorance when you've spent over 30 years interpreting the Constitution? A congressman tried to interrupt. She waved him off with elegance. I'll yield back when corruption yields to justice. The crowd behind her erupted. Applause, cheers, even a whistle from the back row. The chair banged the gavel once. Twice. Order. The chamber will maintain. Order. Crockett didn't flinch. Her eyes locked on the faces across from her. Let me be clear. This isn't about Clarence Thomas alone. This is about the message we send to every American watching. Her voice rose. Not in volume, but in gravity. When a teenager steals food to survive, they go to jail. When a billionaire gifts a judge a yacht, they go to lunch. The line landed like a punch. Audible gasps. A camera clicked. Even a few colleagues on the other side looked stunned. We are not here to protect power. We are here to hold it accountable. And if we can't hold a Supreme Court justice to the same ethical standards as a high school teacher, then this system is broken beyond repair. She reached into the folder one last time. And just so we're clear, it's not just Clarence Thomas who benefits from this silence. It's every official who looks the other way, every pundit who downplays the truth, every donor who buys access with gifts and calls it friendship. She held up one last document, an invitation to a luxury retreat. If this is what friendship looks like, then we need to redefine corruption. The room had stopped breathing. Even the committee chair leaned back in his seat, arms crossed, unsure how to recover the moment. Crockett lowered her hand, softened her tone, and let the silence hang. Then came the line, the one destined for headlines, reels, and protest signs. The only thing thicker than Clarence Thomas's hypocrisy is the list of gifts he forgot to report. Boom, laughter, gasps, shouts of approval. The crowd didn't just react, they erupted. Phones went up, clips went live, hashtags formed in real time. And on the other side of the aisle, the silence was cavernous. For the first time, no one tried to speak. No one rebutted. No one even made eye contact. Crockett gathered her papers slowly, the calm in her movement a striking contrast to the storm she'd just unleashed. I yield back. Even that felt like punctuation. The chair attempted to restore order, but the moment had already outgrown the room. Outside in the hallway, staffers whispered. Journalists raced to file stories. Twitter was already flooded with clips, captioned, memed, edited to music. The takedown was done. But the impact, that was just beginning, because this wasn't just a viral moment. This was a shift, a rupture in the old rules. And the woman at the center of it didn't raise her voice once. She didn't need to. She came with the truth and left the room scorched with it. But the shockwaves didn't end in that room. They spread across the entire nation. The clip hit 10 million views before sunrise. By noon, it was everywhere. Jasmine Crockett's takedown wasn't just a moment. It was the moment. The kind that rewrites narratives, reshapes reputations, and reverberates across timelines, screens, and living rooms. On TikTok, creators reenacted her speech with cinematic filters and swelling background music. Teens edited her line, "The only thing thicker than Clarence Thomas's hypocrisy," into rap beats. Twitter turned it into a thread of congressional mic drops. Instagram filled with stylized quote cards, bold text over black and white stills of her unbothered expression. Hashtags exploded. Crockett claps, back ka, justice for the people. Clarence got cooked by dinner time. Memes were being projected on Times Square billboards. One featured a split screen. Clarence Thomas's blank stare on one side, Crockett's composed glare on the other, with the caption, "When the truth doesn't need to shout." Late-night hosts pounced. Stephen Colbert opened his monologue. With a mock recap, Clarence Thomas was reminded what happens when you try to dodge ethics and run straight into a buzzsaw named Jasmine Crockett. On The Daily Show, guest host Dulce Sloan reenacted the moment while dramatically sipping tea. Laughter, applause, retweets, more virality. But it wasn't just comedy. Commentators across the political spectrum weighed in. Progressive voices called it a turning point, a long-overdue reckoning with judicial elitism. Legal analysts dissected her delivery, measured, factual, impossible to dismiss. Even traditionally reserved anchors couldn't help but acknowledge the cultural gravity. What we witnessed, one pundit remarked, was more than a political rebuke. It was a generational line in the sand. On college campuses, students hosted impromptu viewings. Law professors used it as a case study in accountability. Churches played the clip during sermons on integrity and courage. It resonated across identities. For Black women, it was validation. Proof that speaking boldly could still cut through institutions designed to silence them. For immigrants and working-class families, it was pride. Someone had taken their side and didn't flinch under pressure. For younger voters, it was clarity. Someone wasn't just talking about change. She was it. Crockett's inbox flooded. Emails, letters, DMs. Messages from strangers. "Thank you for saying what we're all screaming. I watched it 3 times and cried. You made me believe again." Even critics were forced to adjust. Conservative commentators tried to pivot. She was disrespectful, too theatrical. But the arguments fell flat because the facts were there. The documents were real, and the delivery? Unshakable, even. Among centrists and fence-sitters, one sentiment echoed loudest. She told the truth. And truth, delivered calmly, courageously, and without apology, is hard to spin. Congressional allies rallied behind her. More investigations were called for. Petitions circulated. Ethics reform bills gained new momentum. And while Thomas remained silent, his image, once draped in untouchable authority, now sat cracked and vulnerable, reshaped by a single afternoon of accountability. But Jasmine Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't need to. Her work spoke louder than victory laps, and while the internet celebrated, while the hashtags surged and the memes flew, Crockett remained, focused, unmoved by applause, committed to the larger battle ahead, because for her, this wasn't just about Clarence Thomas. It never was. It was about something bigger, and yet beyond the memes and headlines, there was a deeper meaning. In the days that followed, Jasmine Crockett was asked again and again, was it personal? She always gave the same answer. No, it was principle. Because for her, this wasn't about scoring points or going viral. It wasn't about headlines or hashtags. It was about a question that every American deserves an answer to. What happens when power forgets it serves the people? Crockett had seen it her whole life. People punished for small mistakes while the powerful escaped consequence. A mother evicted over $200 in missed rent. A young man jailed for stealing diapers. A student arrested for protesting tuition hikes. Meanwhile, those in robes and suits took yachts, trips, and checks, and shrugged, so when she spoke, she wasn't just addressing Clarence Thomas. She was speaking to a nation that's been told to stay quiet, to wait, to obey. And she was showing, by example, that dignity doesn't mean silence, that you can speak truth to power without shouting, that you can confront corruption with calm, that you can be unrelenting and still be graceful, because real strength isn't in cruelty. It's in clarity. She reminded people that accountability isn't an attack. It's a promise to the people, to the Constitution, and to the future. And maybe, just maybe, that's why the moment landed so hard. Not because it was savage, but because it was just, because in a system where so many are told to shrink, Crockett stood tall. She didn't speak for political gain. She spoke for the teacher who buys her own supplies, the janitor who can't afford insulin, the immigrant working double shifts, the single mom battling bureaucracy, the activist who's tired, the student who's scared, the dreamer who's doubted. She spoke for them, not just in that room, but through them. Because what Clarence Thomas represented wasn't just scandal. It was a symbol of what happens when institutions forget who they're supposed to serve. And Crockett's words were a reminder. We deserve better. Better leaders. Better ethics. Better courage. She didn't tear someone down. She pulled the curtain back, and once the truth is exposed, it can't be ignored. Her message was clear: power must be held to account. And silence in the face of injustice is complicity. Because in the end, this wasn't just about Clarence Thomas. It was about us. What started as just another hearing ended with a line that shook the country. Jasmine Crockett destroys. Clarence Thomas wasn't just a headline, it was a turning point. A moment when truth met arrogance and didn't back down. She didn't yell. She didn't insult. She didn't perform. She revealed. She reminded. She reclaimed the room because when institutions bend under the weight of privilege, we need voices that cut through the noise. Voices that are sharp, fearless, and rooted in something deeper than politics. Principle. That's what Jasmine Crockett gave us. Not just a takedown, but a blueprint. A reminder that silence isn't strength, and that standing up with dignity is the most powerful move of all. So if that moment hit you, if it made you sit up, cheer, cry, or finally feel seen, don't let it fade. Subscribe, share this video, be part of the movement. Because what happened in that room wasn't just Crockett versus Thomas. It was truth versus power. It was justice versus corruption. It was us versus silence, and we're just getting started.